Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October webinar in AgilQuest Agile Workplace Leaders Series. These are educational lectures and panel discussions from the leaders and innovators in the alternative workplace strategy arena to benefit and support your workplace plans and programs. Those of you who have joined the prior webinars or have listened to the webinars on our website know that they aren't focused on our hoteling technology, but rather on the techniques and methods for making the most of your program regardless of which vendors that you choose. Today's topic explores a new area for our series, but one that is critical to workplace program success. Leading during a crisis and dramatic change is a skill that we all understand we need. Our organizations and programs are counting on us to reach success no matter what we encounter. Today we have an expert on leadership, change in large organizations, and in the kinds of crises and challenges we might face. Martha Johnson is a leadership speaker and writer with a 3-decade career in business and government. She was nominated by President Obama and confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate to be the Administrator of the U.S. General Services Administration, a position she held from 2010 to 2012. She also served 8 years with the Clinton administration, and her private sector career has spanned information technology, architecture, strategic consulting, and automotive industries. Martha speaks on topics including leadership, organizational transformation, sustainability, and government innovation. She's also an author and just last week released her new book, On My Watch, Leadership, Innovation, and Personal Resilience, which shares universal lessons she gained while running the massive and complex GSA. We highly recommend ordering a copy, which is now available on Amazon.com or on her website, marthajohnson.com. Today's presentation is actually based on sections of her book, and we're very excited to hear what she has to say. We'll also have some audience interaction during today's presentation. Martha will pose a few questions to the audience and will ask you to respond. When answering a question from the speaker, please type your response in the chat box on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen. Make sure the "to" is set to all panelists. Martha's also saved some time at the end of today's talk to take your questions, so as you think of them, please type your questions into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen, and be sure to leave the "to" setting on the all panelists so that the entire team here can see your question. By typing in your questions as soon as you think of it, you'll make sure it's remembered by the end, and it'll be the top of our first asked, first answered queue. So at this point, I'd like to hand the presentation over to you, Martha.
Well, thank you very much. I am so delighted to be here and to have a chance to spend a good hour with the participants on this subject of resilience for leaders, particularly when it comes to workplace crisis. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I will spend some time chatting, but I don't like just to hear my voice, so I'm going to be thrilled if you ask some questions and we can be responding to the ideas and issues that you see inside this subject. All right, so let's jump in. First of all, I want to talk about what the problem is I'm addressing today so that we're all on the same page. I'm thinking about resilience and I'm thinking about risk with respect to leaders, but that comes in a particular way when you're thinking about the problems that workplaces can bump into. And there are probably two major ones. One is we can be in big changes these days as we engage and move our workforces into new work environments, new workplaces with new technologies and terms and cultural expectations. It's a very exciting time. I know we were particularly excited by some of the work we were doing at GSA with this regard. So I call it the yippee moment. But there's also a bit of a yikes about it. There are times when a new workplace can be disruptive or unsettling, and there's a lot that needs to be addressed around that, and because it is a big change. The second workplace environment issue that I want to put on the table is the sudden event, and this is what we tend to think of when we think about workplace risk, but it is when the workplace is in jeopardy, and I would call that a double yikes. We are facing those kinds of situations more and more regularly. When I was in office, we had an earthquake in Washington, and suddenly there was all sorts of double yikes about the various buildings around Washington. I was watching the PBS NewsHour last night, and they were doing a one-year reprise about Sandy and talking about what Verizon has had to go through in order to both restore and set itself up for the possibility that water could come up and over and into their facilities in lower Manhattan. Really quite an extraordinary story, but a typical almost example of what we are talking about today. I think there are many other examples of weather environments. I live in Annapolis, and a couple of years ago, Hurricane Isabel came through and completely flooded the Naval Academy and washed out some of its major computer systems. You can imagine what kind of workplace scramble they had to do. I also want us to be imaginative as we think about workplaces. Obviously, it is not just office buildings or computer centers. I think there are some real workplace disaster stories that we can draw from. And I think, for example, the Chilean miner incident a couple of years ago. Obviously, there are some very dangerous workplaces and ones in which safety and risk are uppermost in people's concerns. Think about the movie The Right Stuff. We send people off into space in a new kind of workspace and the sort of things that they have to encounter there. So let's be expansive in our thinking of our examples, but the bottom line is I would like us to think about how leaders face this issue of risk as they think about their organizations and they think about the workplace that their organizations are functioning in. The first thing that jumps to mind, of course, is that leaders already invest a great deal in preparedness and readiness. We have spent a great deal of time thinking about this specifically since 9/11, but much, much, much longer always. And we have everything from COOP plans to disaster mitigation. I know there is a lot of pounding on the table around communications, being sure that we are good at communications and that our communication systems are redundant and capable. We engage a lot in change management so that, and crisis management so that we know who are the people that would be designated to step in case in time of a crisis. Everything from ambassadors and floor captains all the way up to policies and protocols. So I don't want to in any way dismiss the fact that we have already invested a great deal in readiness, but I would point out that we are investing in organizational readiness. And the real question I want to ask today, the slightly different one, is are we addressing leadership readiness? I think leaders have a particularly challenging role to play when there is a yikes or a double yikes in their organizational life, not because they haven't thought about how they would react to crisis, but because they have to do it so publicly. They set the stage. They create a momentum and a sense of what is possible. It is really a time when they need to, when they are personally on display. And I think that is an underlying question that we need to pay some attention to. So is a leader personally ready? Are they able to understand and react under stress, not just for themselves, but in terms of what others see in them? And there are plenty of ways in which this can be temporary or pretty substantial disaster. But what happens if something that a leader has invested in hits the wall, a new workplace venture? And how would the leader handle a crisis or an emergency? I want to put that on the table because I think in many ways we actually avoid this. Leaders don't like to add doubt to the list of problems. So there is just a basic human tendency to sort of smooth over any issues. You know, we don't want to invite trouble. We want to believe we are prepared. After all, we're leaders and we're invested with this responsibility, and we just believe that things will work out. But I think underneath that, we're still just a little bit hesitant about it. And frankly, there's not a lot of time. We don't have much time to devote in a normal day to even the routines that we are taking care of. And to step aside and say, what if the program, the workplace that we're involved in is going to be challenged, or there's a disaster coming, what do we do? And, you know, bottom line is we also don't want to appear paranoid or nervous. Leaders like to look strong and confident and have a lot of pride in how they appear. Bottom line, I think a lot of leaders do a lot of hoping. They do preparations, but they also do a lot of hoping. And I don't think we should discount the fact that leaders are human beings, and that is not an abnormal response. But it is on our minds, and I know each of you probably thinks about this at the odd moment, but the question is, how would I react? How would I react? And you know, it's all over the place. There's a lot of, you know, little worries that run around in our minds, and I've got some pictures here to remind you of some of those little worries, probably. You know, am I going to react by just getting a massive headache and succumbing to, you know, drama? Do I need an ice cap, or am I going to be reacting by just throwing things around, just sort of hysteria, just throwing bombs all over the place? Am I going to run to the exit? Or am I going to step back and just look like a blank slate? You know, what do we do? Don't have a clue. Pretty much of a vacuum in terms of a leadership style. Or am I going to be kind of a hammer, issue instructions, start ordering everybody around, bam, bam, bam. And of course, the one thing I know I would do in a crisis is I would eat. And I think it has to be said that we do react in very human ways. So what I want to do now is move into the question of it's crucial, and we have various ways in which we need to really get a grip on the fact that this is a very crucial issue for us. And there are a couple of insidious things going on that push us to disregard this. So one of the reasons that I want to put on the table is the myth that leaders are born in crisis. I believe this is kind of a stupid strategy to rely on. I know it's true. It is certainly true that Franklin Roosevelt rose to the moment. Churchill is, much is written about how Churchill stepped up to lead England in the time of crisis. We think about 9/11 and the mayor, Mayor Giuliani, was there in a way that everybody recognized was leaderly and confident. And you might want to think about some other examples. Who else has become kind of mythic because they have stepped up in times of crisis? It is true that leaders are born in crisis, but if you think about the examples, and that's why I'm interested if you have any others, if you think about them, it's always a sort of bigger-than-life story, and it is a rather backwards way of preparing, just sort of saying, well, when it happens, somebody will step up. So I think if we sit on this myth, we are going to get ourselves into trouble. So send me any examples of other people who have risen to the occasion, and let's see if they are always the mythic characters that I think they are. This question is also crucial because resiliency makes leaders more effective overall. It demands self-awareness, flexibility, and agility, and those are all signs of a leader. If you think about it, leaders really need to be self-aware because by virtue of their position, very few people are going to come to them and tell them what they're not doing well. They need to develop an acute sense of self-awareness so that they can view themselves and understand what they are doing almost as if they are stepping outside themselves. They are not going to get the sort of honest feedback you wish they would get, so they need to be self-aware. Leaders need to be agile. They need to be really quick to absorb what's going on and to respond to change. And leaders need to be really flexible. And this is basically a business need. They need to be flexible so they can respond to the market very quickly. And so if we are thinking about resiliency, we are thinking about those kinds of characteristics, self-awareness, flexibility, and agility. And I think resiliency is a skill that isn't just good in a time of crisis, but is good for leaders overall. And then, see if I can do this properly. There we go. The third question, the third reason this question is crucial is because we are living in an era of black swans. I suppose many of you have read the book about the notion that there are black swans out there. They are sort of once-in-a-century disasters. The trick is they are now surfacing more regularly. we are, it's a popular theory, and it seems to have slipped into our bloodstream that the weird things only happen at odd times. But in actuality, we are in a global world in which a disaster or crisis in one part of the world affects us and vice versa. So it is important for us to be ready to be resilient because these black swans are becoming more common. I'm thinking about, for example, the natural disasters that we've been facing recently, the fires in Colorado and Hurricane Sandy and so forth. I'm also thinking about financial meltdowns. This isn't just a weather problem. This is also a human issue. So for a number of reasons, the question of how leaders are going to react in crisis is pretty important. So I hope that convinces you that we've got something on the table here that's important. What strategies, therefore, are available? I've got your attention. This is important, but what do we do about this? And again, I want to be thinking about leaders and thinking about that particular problem of a leader being caught in a moment that is an unusual moment in which something is happening that was off script, and the leader has to respond. Now, they'll respond as a person, but they also respond in a way that affects the whole organization. And that's why it's important to unpack the leader's response. So let me start with three resilience strategies, and this is the bulk of what I want to be talking about today. And I want to flesh out and see how this hits you and what else you might be thinking of, what else it sparks in you. First of all, I think it is actually quite useful to sort through a person's own personal stories of crisis, disaster, and emergencies. One of the first things we know is that leaders need to have a sense of confidence that they will be able to respond in the course of some sort of disaster or crisis. One of the ways to do that is to begin to extract lessons from how one responds to crisis, smaller kinds of crises or disasters or little emergencies in one's personal life or simply in one's history, professional or personal. And I want to paint a little picture of this for you so you can get the hang of what I'm talking about. But I'd like you to be thinking about this and think about it in terms of yourself so that you as a leader and you as someone who might be supporting a leader can begin to appreciate what you might be drawing from. One of my stories, and this is sort of a little domestic story, is that my husband and I one day were working in the kitchen cooking. This was a rare moment of marital bliss when we were cooking together, and he managed to get his fingers caught in a mixer. This is one of those little disasters that you think about and you just dread. And his fingers got caught in the mixer. I wasn't next to him, but I heard the sound, and I whirled around and I yanked out the cord. Totally surprised him, totally surprised me, because I don't tend to get really focused in times of emergencies. At least that's not how I think about myself. But it immediately stopped the beaters, and he extracted his fingers, and they were actually fine, wouldn't you know. But the lesson I took from that is that I heard, it was through my ears that I recognized the disaster faster than very, very quickly. I don't know if I would have reacted differently if I had seen it, if I would have reacted more quickly or less quickly. But I do know that I have a sort of an ear to the ground, and I respond when I take something in by hearing it. And I respond very rationally, so that's good news here. Another story would be, again, one of my own. It's from the morning of 9/11, and it was after the news was reporting that the second tower was collapsing. And we got a phone call. I was at home in Annapolis, and we got a phone call, and it was from a friend of mine who was in Europe. And she had seen the news, and she immediately got on the phone to call me and ask if I was okay and where was I and all of that. And I surprised myself, I must say, because I was almost abrupt. And I said to her, I think we're fine, and we should get off the phone and open the lines, keep the lines open. It was, for me, a different reaction than I would normally have had in other settings, because usually I don't get curt or directive right away, especially on the phone with a friend. And I just realized that I can go into a very rational mode and issue orders really quickly, even to people who aren't ready to take them, without a moment's notice. That was an interesting little tidbit for me to take away and to hold in my collection of known responses, so that I would understand how I would respond were I acting in a leadership role in a different kind of a crisis. Now, one other thing I will say is that in my experience inventory, I am the daughter of a minister, a Presbyterian minister, and I therefore have had some experience as a child when I was living at home with funerals, with calls in the night. When people have died, they call the minister in the middle of the night, doesn't matter when, calls on vacation, sort of these surprise insertions into our life of something that has happened, a death of someone. And I'm also experienced in the world of rituals around disasters, as well as the mechanics of those kinds of disasters. When someone dies, I understand a lot about what is done and what tone is taken and what the responses are from the minister's point of view. And that was a little bit of understanding I didn't know I had about how to handle myself in more public crisis. I had a couple of experiences I can relate to where that I drew a direct line to that. I was back in the Clinton administration, part of the Department of Commerce, and the secretary was killed in a plane crash. And I was immediately almost, I hate to say it, but I was almost comfortable in what needed to be done and how to react. And it all went back to that training and experience I'd had growing up. And then even later, when I had to quickly resign from the Obama administration and then was thrust in front of a couple of congressional hearings that were not particularly fun or particularly sympathetic, I understood about how one holds dignity in a time of crisis, in a time when things are tough. All of those lessons add up for me about what and how I will react if I am in a crisis. And I think that there are probably others that would be good for me to unpack and to hold in the ready. But I invite you to think in the same way. Think back over your experiences and how have you responded, but what, not just the story of it, but what can you extract from that? What is the characteristics, the value, the behavior, the style, the decision-making that you will do when you are in a different kind of a crisis. So I am interested in you thinking about what your stories are, and I would really invite you to share a couple of them here or wherever is comfortable or in the Q&A, because it's interesting to hear what people surface and what they can then rely on. So that's one resilience strategy, a little bit of preparation, a little bit of inventory taking. I would also like to suggest that you, in the same vein, listen to and learn from the stories and experiences of others. One of the things about a time when something is happening that is sudden, that might be dangerous, is that we often go into kind of routinized responses. We are not trying to invent new ways to respond. And it is helpful to be able to imitate things that we have seen, behaviors that we have seen, actions and examples. I believe this is one of those points in one's own personal education that it's wonderful to read case histories and to hear of other examples and to understand what's beneath them. For example, there's a Harvard Business Review article about well, there are a number of them actually, about the Chilean mining disaster and how people stepped up and and what they did. And those are very, very useful templates to have in your mind as you think forward about possible responses that you might make. It was interesting, in one of those cases it talked about one of the major decision makers the engineering decision maker had to both be issuing very, very exact operational directions, because there were so many people coming at the situation, so many experts and so many ideas and offers of help. He needed to be really clear and really explicit in issuing orders and directions. So his operational capabilities had to be, really on top. But at the same time, this was a disaster for which they really didn't have a clear idea about how to solve the problem. And so although he needed to be issuing really strict and clear instructions, he also needed to be very open to a collaborative, innovative world of thinking, inviting and hearing from people so that they could be inventing the solution. So he had to function in almost opposing manners, both being very strict and clear and then being very open and questioning and curious. And they spoke in the article about how he was able to maintain that balance. And he was also explicit when he was in one or the other. So he was defining what he was doing when, and therefore no one got confused. But that template is a wonderful template for us as we think forward about what we might need to draw on, and how it's both important to recognize we need to have different styles of responding, and we might need to be really clear with everybody about which style we're using at any given moment. Because in a crisis situation, all kinds of things are magnified and blown out of proportion. So explore and listen and ask, and in fact, this is one of those wonderful cocktail party conversations where you can ask for other people's experiences and see what other themes you might be able to extract underneath about how people have responded to particularly challenging times. I think the questions are good in general. It's also very helpful to ask explicitly about workplace. When have you been in a workplace where something has happened, and how did that affect you? How did you respond? How did the people around you respond? And listen to those stories and see what happens. I think that will add up to some interesting conversation and some really particularly terrific lessons. So just as with the first strategy, I'd invite you to share, if you have any thoughts about that, what templates you might have picked up from other people, what examples you have seen, and help us build out our inventories of those stories. Now for the third resilience strategy, I want to talk about the notion of surprise. And this goes back to my days as a young mother. I have two children. They're grown up now, and they allow me to tell this story. But when they were young and something would happen to them, they'd run into the wall or they'd fall off a bike or whatever, and they would come running to me, and my question to them was, are you hurt or are you surprised? And they, to this day, just roll their eyes about this because, of course, they're hurt. They're bleeding, for heaven's sakes. Can't I see this, and why would I be asking an either-or question? Well, my point in doing that was to begin to give them some capability about extracting from a moment of pain the moment of surprise that always is right next to it. People, when they hit a crisis, there's a lot of pain involved in it, but you should not assume that there's no surprise. In fact, you should also look for it, because the surprise is the bounce. The surprise is the energy forward. It's a little startled. I'm not talking about shock. I'm talking about surprise. But it is the little boost forward of, oh, well, that sort of changed things, and maybe there's some possibilities that have been opened up. Oftentimes, surprises are considered very positive things: surprise birthday party, surprise presents, and so on. So I want to raise the issue of surprise as a positive thing that can be taken out of settings and encourage people to look for it. You've got to be intentional about this because the pain can be overwhelming. I have, of course, my own stories about this, but I know you have some where you have been both, you know, completely flummoxed, but at the same time there was a little bit of surprise in it that allowed you to open a window or ask a question or turn a corner or flip a switch that had been stuck in the past. So surprise is the notion here underlying the resilience strategy for leaders. However, there are two orders of surprise. The first order of surprise is literally, what is the surprise in the moment? What, just as I've been saying, what surprise is right there alongside the pain, the hurt, the anger, the fear, and get that nailed. Then there is a second order of surprise. It won't happen right away, but I think that there's tremendous benefit if you can turn around and offer yourself back as a surprise. And what I mean by this is there is a way in which when crisis happens, a person and a leader can be kind of overwhelmed by it, and they have to adjust and they have to go through some things to start fixing the situation. But one of the truly wonderful things that can happen on the other side is when a person has taken themselves through that moment and can emerge and offer themselves back to the world as a surprise in a positive sense. So it's to become the surprise that is the second order of value here inside this little strategy. You know, my version of this was that I went through a pretty big crisis when I resigned as the administrator of the General Services Administration. It was a painful moment. It was kind of a surprise too in so many ways. And I needed to, you know, get out of Dodge, come home, kind of regroup. And when I was home and trying to figure out what to do next, I picked up a book that I had been working on, been writing, and I finished it. And so the first public thing I did after I resigned as the administrator and did all the congressional hearings and then sort of stepped aside, the next public thing I did was to publish a novel. And that invited so much surprise from people. I mean, I was the surprise. It wasn't so much, I mean, it was just unexpected. I don't think anybody really thought I was going to publish a novel about a gay boy in southern Indiana in 1990. And that's what I did. And it gave me a huge bounce. It gave me a huge sense of confidence. It gave me a huge redirect, and it created a different conversation. I didn't have to sit around and talk about the disaster. I could talk about the next thing. So surprise is a terrific side effect of a crisis. If you are in a workplace and there is something that slams into you, like the Verizon story in Lower Manhattan where all their equipment was flooded, the surprise is that they actually found some ways in which they could very quickly restore what they had, and by investing in fiber optics rather than copper, they could become very secure and resilient the next round, but it was the surprise of the lessons that they learned that just made their next step and their next round of work so much easier. So those are 3 resilience strategies, and I am very keen on understanding if any of those hits home for you, if you can see them, understand them, respond to them, and if they're of any meaning to you. I'd be really interested in what your experience inventory is when you have hit a wall of some sort. What other stories have you observed? What templates do you have from others? And where and how would you find it possible to use surprise as a counterbalance to something that is enormously upsetting, a disaster, an emergency, or a crisis in the workplace? So I'm going to summarize what I've talked about, and then I'd like to get the questions going here. And they don't have to be questions. I'd love to hear the stories, too. So there is a potential for workplace crisis, and it should not be ignored. We know that, and we invest a great deal in resilience already, but let's nurture leadership resilience. There are 3 strategies that are useful for that: understanding your own experience inventory, borrowing templates from others, and employing surprises. And in the words of the wise, Joseph Campbell says, "We must be willing to let go of the life we have planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." This goes to the attitude that we need to have when it comes to the uncertainties and the unplanned events that happen to us in all aspects of life, and particularly from your point of view from those workplace environments and what can happen there. We can plan and plan and plan, but if we are only planning, we will miss what is actually waiting for us on the other side. And then I love Elizabeth Taylor. She says, when the crisis hits, pour yourself a drink, put on some lipstick, and pull yourself together. The woman knew what she was talking about. So with that, I'd like to now ask if there are questions or stories about resilience. I'd be very interested if any of this hit you in some particular way, new, fresh, curious, or what questions you might have. It's always hard to start these things, so if you want to send them along online, let's do that. And I will stop talking now one way and see what I can urge out of you.
Well, what a great topic. Thank you so much, Martha, for all this information. And I actually have a couple questions myself, but we can get started with the questions that the audience has already asked. And just a reminder, this is the time for you to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen to enter your question into the queue, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the order they come in. So please type your question in right away. And please feel free to share your stories as well in that chat box there on the right-hand side of your screen. So Martha, one of the first questions we have is, given a crisis, how do you communicate urgently to workers who are not all in the office?
Well, I think we ran into that when we had the earthquakes at the General Services Administration. I was up in Boston, and there was I was in Boston, and the various buildings managers and public building service people were trying to be coordinated. I think, first of all, we do need to think about other ways in which we can be communicating outside of our typical lines. I think those are pretty normal COOP kinds of discussions. What backup capabilities or technologies or techniques do we have? If people are working from home and this goes to, a snowstorm. If you're at home and you can't turn on your television and you can't turn on your internet, how do you find out when and if you are to stay home or go back to work? It doesn't hurt to see if there's any way in which people can have maps or coordination so that people know literally physically where everybody is. I think especially when you're out of the office, some of this is about identifying where people are and being able to get to them literally by walking down the street and knocking on their door if somebody's nearby. So it's those sort of communication chains that I don't think are really difficult if people are just sharing that kind of information. I also think people need to counsel patience. We are now in a place where if we aren't hearing within 3 minutes, we think we are desperately out of communication and this is a bad thing. I think we can probably switch gears a little bit and understand that communications will be coming, but not place such an expectation around such instantaneous communication. And then there's very basic things. I worked at the Department of Commerce, and NOAA has a very extensive radio system that are for emergencies, and it's useful to be sure you have a radio and that there's information going in and out over the radio. But those are more COOP responses.
That's great. Thank you, Martha. The next question is, do you think resilience is a skill that can be taught by someone to someone, or does it just come from experience or personality?
Oh, I think that's probably a question to throw right back at the questioner. But I'll give you my humble opinion, and we can discuss it. I think when we talk about great leaders emerging in crisis, we sort of have this idea that this is someplace deep in someone's character and they'll step out. I'm sure it's not quite so simple. I don't think it's just character, it's experience. It's also about people being asked to do something that they haven't been asked before. We all know that when we are challenged, we can step up differently than if we aren't challenged. And so I don't think it's just past experience. I don't think it's training. I don't think it's the immediate crisis. I think it's a little bit of all of those things. What I'm concerned about is that we sort of blow by it too much, and we are sort of just putting it on the back burner, hoping that it'll take care of itself when we already have some techniques and capabilities that we should just be securing and knowing and understanding and discussing. I think the biggest hazard is just being completely blind, and I don't think we need to be completely blind, whether or not people are more experienced than others or have a different kind of character than others. We can at least level the playing field by having all talked about it and being a little bit more prepared.
Great. The next question from the audience is, in your opinion, is leadership in government different than other arenas?
Oh, absolutely. There is, the fundamentals of leadership are the same everywhere, I believe, and people need to have a sense of values and responsibility and good communication and so on. The context in government is very different from the private sector. I think it is much more constricted. There is a much smaller room to move and a much sharper margin of error that needs to be recognized. And I think that's all torqued up now because technology is watching 24/7, meaning that there's a lot more that's on public display now, so the tolerances are even tighter. You know, I personally felt that the biggest difference between government and business leadership was around were cultural differences. Not so much how do you make a plan and how do you work with money and how do you hire people. It's much more about the differences in the cultures. And the culture in government, I mean, it's kind of interesting. The culture in government is overall, people keep thinking there's a monolithic culture in government, and that's just not true. If you know government and you're inside government, you know that there are as many different cultures inside government as there possibly could be. You can have very formal offices, you can have very informal, Silicon Valley kind of loose offices. You can have offices that have very high levels of trust, and you can have offices that have very low levels of trust. So it's not all one thing inside government, although there is a bit of a paintbrush attitude about it, that it's somehow cumbersome and slow. So there's some cultural differences, but inside that, even more, is the fact that a leader in government has to reconcile two cultures that the government is struggling to reconcile itself. And those are, if you go back to the 1880s with the early Civil Service Act, there was some very significant law that was created to protect civil servants. And that law has to do with avoiding and prohibiting political messing around when that's not suitable for what the agencies need to be doing. And it has created a culture of rights that is very important. It's a culture of due process, a culture of respect of the rights of civil servants. That does not exist in the private sector in any way as intensely. private sector workers do not have those kinds, the rights and the process to the extent that they do in the government. And then, you know, a century later, in like the 1980s, 1990s, we began to become really torqued up as a nation around performance, around productivity and performance. And that began to enter the government in a pretty steady string of legislation around, you know, CFO Acts and procurement law and so on to encourage and legislate much better performance and productivity. Now, performance and productivity is all about responding quickly and well, and that culture is one that everybody is excited about encouraging. But at the same time, it bumps right against that culture of rights, which is about due process. And I think the leaders in government, that is probably one of the most significant differences, is that they need to reconcile the culture of rights with the culture of performance, where on the business side, the culture of performance is a much more dominating culture. So that's a kind of a conceptual answer, but that's literally what I ran into over and over again. How do you extract performance and also be sure, be rigorously sure you're fair to everyone to a particularly strong standard? And that is a big challenge for leadership, both political and political and career leadership in the government.
That's great, Martha. Thank you. We actually have someone from our audience that wanted to share one of their stories, and they said that they were in a situation with an aggressive individual, but instead of continuing the aggression, they stayed calm and began asking questions that were not expected to take their mind off the situation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's exactly, that is a great example, and it's in these small examples, although I'm sure the situation wasn't small to the person at the moment, but it's in those kinds of day-to-day kind of experiences. If someone is suddenly about to attack and you can manage to deflect the purpose of the situation and turn it into something else, that's a huge skill, and it's a huge capability that you don't even get to know you have until you're in those sorts of situations. I know that is an example that many people share with me when we're having this kind of conversation. They're talking about, I was alone, I was in a situation, suddenly I was in imminent danger from another person or people, and they're traumatic experiences. But there is a lot to be learned about how your rational self can step forward, how your ability to sort of strategize in the moment can be right there, and how you want to open up the situation by asking questions. I think that's exactly it's a marvelous example of how you try to figure out how to get out of the situation by opening it up rather than getting it tighter and more closed. Milk that one all you can, because there's probably some interesting lessons underneath even those obvious ones.
Yeah, exactly. An interesting question here from the audience. Any example on how diversity in the workplace and the multiple points of view has increased or decreased resilience?
Well, you know, I take it on faith that it's increased resilience, just because it keeps our sort of collective muscle from settling into thinking things are done in one way, or things are spoken about in one way, or things are referenced in the same way, or that our experiences are common ones. I have long felt that the more inclusive a workplace, the more a workplace has had to step up and realize that there's a broader continuum of capability and responses to just about anything, to analysis, to interpretation, to operations, and so on. And if that is part of the culture of an organization, to embrace inclusion, to be comfortable with that, it means the organization has already understood that there is not always one answer, that there is not always one way to do things, that there are that it can be creative together, because there will be different ideas than each individual will generate themselves. And there is also, I think, the potential for a stronger sense of a team, because the team becomes more capable at producing a better result, and that becomes more of the defining aspect of a team than the fact that the team all looks the same. So I think no question, but diversity would help with the sort of attitude and outlook and experience that the group has around dealing with things that aren't in the comfort zone for each individual in the team. And I hadn't really put that together. We probably need to be interesting if there's various documentation or further real study about that, because I am simply referring to just knee-jerk instinct. It just has to be better, but we should probably do some verification.
Great. Is there a 1, 2, 3-step exercise that you would recommend for figuring out what to do during that time of crisis?
Well, I can certainly manufacture one. I'm not sure if I can say it's you do this first, this second, and this third, but there are probably a handful of things that need to be done simultaneously. The first one is to open communication channels, to get as much information as you can and learn the situation as it's unfolding. The caveat to that is you can't wait for information. Sometimes you have to keep moving even though you don't know everything. So it is one of the initial things you need is communications, but you also need to keep moving, keep assessing and making decisions, because time goes on, and you have to know when you have enough. You don't have all you want, but you have enough. You don't have all enough time that you need, but you have enough. You don't have all the information you need, but you have enough. So it's grabbing as much as you can and then moving. So one of those handful of things is to open communications and to take it in as fast as you can. The second, I think, is to to pay attention to how you are responding. There is a long-standing metaphor for leaders and organizations, and that is the metaphor of the gear shift. You even see it on clip art now, where the leader is the big gear, and then the next set of people are the middle gears, and then the rest of the people in the organization are the small gears. And we all know that if the big gear is turning at a steady pace, everybody else can be moving quickly and performing. But if the big gear starts jerking back and forth, stopping and starting, the medium and then the smaller gears are going to get really jammed up, and they might even get to the point where they strip because they are being jerked back and forth so much it unsettles their structures. So a leader needs to pay attention right from the beginning to sending signals, not just communications, but signals of that will not flummox the organization more than necessary. Panicking, hand-wringing, running around like a chicken without its head on, those kinds of sayings are what need to be held in check. So there's communications, personal management, and then I find a lot of people refer to trying to absorb what's going on. It's not just the communication that's coming in, but it's about absorbing it, understanding it, mapping it. So I think that those notions of what they call war rooms or crisis centers are pretty important, where you're finding that what you're learning is at least being scatter diagrammed up in a way that you can start making sense out of it. Because it comes in oddly, but the picture needs to be painted as promptly as possible. not just for the leader, but so that the leader can be using that to explain what needs to go on next. So there's a personal level and then a systems level. Communications, personal management, and then a way of sharing what is known in the direction forward in a very almost visible way. Those would be the three things I'd go for first.
Great. So I think we have time for one final question. Mm-hmm. At what point do you take a step back and let someone else take over?
Oh, good question. I think one of the biggest problems leaders face is the issue of succession. And that isn't just succession in the normal course of events. It's succession, so to speak, for times of crisis as well. Who else has is available? Who else has some of the perspective and has some of the training and some of the sense of responsibility that they could step in? I think that the first issue is if you step down, you got to have somebody who can step in. And that is, of course, is complicated in government because it's not always up to you. You don't always get to choose. But in general, I think it's important to have, I guess the rule of thumb, we talk about what happens if you're run over by a beer truck tonight, who's going to step in tomorrow? Do you have 2 or 3 people that can do that? I think that's just standard good leadership to be thinking about your successors and who's capable. Then this goes to self-awareness. We need to, as leaders, know how we're coming across, how we're doing. We need to be able to assess our own health, our own clarity, and that is pretty important to answer that question so that you're really monitoring yourself as well and understanding when and if you might be becoming less effective than you should be. Now, leaders are really stuck because they don't get a lot of feedback. They don't get a lot of honest feedback. And as much as you can develop your own self-awareness, you also have to develop ways in which you have trusted people who you know will tell you what you and that you trust that you can listen to them. And I think that's a very tricky and subtle thing to be creating, but you need to have people that can say to you, time for you to go, and you need to back off, or you need to go sleep for a week, or whatever the issue is. Step down for a while, and that you can hear them and trust them. So I don't think there's a rule of thumb about when and where and how you can make those decisions, but I think you need to have some of the skeleton in place, some of the bones and muscles around you, so that you can know that there are people that can step in place and they can talk to you honestly about that, and you can talk to yourself so that you can assess the situation. And I think that would be it.
Great. Well, this was really excellent feedback and great answers to all the questions. Thank you, Martha, for taking the time to share your experience and knowledge with us. And we just want to thank all of you on the line for attending and asking those great questions. The webinar has been recorded, and you can receive an email link so you can share today's presentation with others in your organization. Also, please be sure to visit Martha's website for the details on her new book and the special limited edition copies she has available. This is the final Workplace Leaders webinar for 2013, but please don't forget we have the AgilQuest user group meeting coming up in December. Keep your eye on the email inbox for our announcements on the 2014 webinar series, which will resume in January. Thanks again from all of us here at AgilQuest, and have a great rest of your day.